attacking our religious freedoms. And hundreds of entities exist for the sole purpose of making your practice of your Christian or religious faith more difficult, or in some cases even impossible. And it doesn't stop there. They want to restrict or even eliminate your right to pray and practice your deeply held religious beliefs. And they'll spare no expense, resource, or even litigation to stop you on their journey to restrict your religious freedoms. Moreover, regrettably, actual hate crimes against people of faith are up year after year in the double digits. And the mainstream media has not been a friend of believers. Think I'm exaggerating or being unfair? Well, then keep listening. My guest and I tonight will discuss some of the many religious freedoms and rights issues that are under constant and relentless attack in every city, county, state, and at the federal level across the entire United States. And we will hopefully convince those of you of faith that you are in a fight for our very religious rights and freedoms. But don't worry. This isn't the first time Christ's disciples and churches have been under attack. Indeed, that's one of the oldest and most repeated storylines in the evil one's playbook. Our ancestors have been here before. In fact, some would argue we never left the Christian church battlefield. The only question is if you and I, the current generation of Christ's disciples, are prepared to do whatever it takes within the law to protect and share Christ's love and message. And don't take my word for it, that we're in a battle of epic proportions. I'm again going to quote from one of my favorite quotes from a modern day Orthodox saint who actually lived in our time. So he gets where we are right now. This is from St. Paisios the Athonite, as he tried to exhort us to rise up and address those who would seek to silence our spreading of the word. Here's what St. Paisios said, and I quote, "The spirit of lukewarmness reigns. We've been spoiled for the good. How does God still tolerate us? Today's generation is the generation of indifference. There are no warriors. The majority are fit for parades and feasts only. We have to witness our faith with boldness, because if we continue to remain silent, we'll have to answer in the end. In these difficult days, each must do what is in their power. Leave what's out of their power to God. In this way, our conscience will be clear," end quote. If you're ready to hear about the current battle against your religious freedom, if you're ready to become the warrior for Christ that St. Paisios implored you to be, then you've tuned in to the right program. Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to Stewardship Calling in the first Wednesday series here on Ancient Faith Radio. This is Bill Marianes from stewardshipcalling.com, coming to you from the shores of beautiful Lake Lanier in Gainesville, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. I have a very simple premise that you have been called by your Creator to a personal calling, a reason to your life and a reason for your life, something you need to do with all of the gifts over which God has made you a steward. It's what I call your stewardship calling. And St. Paul repeatedly makes this crystal clear to us that we each, every one of us, have a calling. In his letter to the Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, he clearly states, quote, "I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called," end quote. Now, until 2017, by day, I was blessed to be a partner in two great global law firms of over 1,100 lawyers each, where I served in management, including as managing partner of our Atlanta office, and practiced in the area of mergers and acquisitions and corporate law. But my personal calling is to be a stewardship calling evangelist. I'm here to hopefully help people and parishes discover and live their stewardship callings so that they may have a good account before the awesome judgment seat of Christ. Now, this program and a lot of other helpful tools and information about effective churches and stewardship and church strategic planning and servant leadership and a bunch of other topics can be found at my always free website, stewardshipcalling.com. That's stewardshipcalling.com. And you can always reach me at bill@stewardshipcalling.com. And to our listeners tonight, we'd love you to join us by calling in and interacting with my special guest by calling at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Now, as I always do before I introduce my guest, let me set the stage with some relevant data and information. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's report in 2021, 14.1% of all hate crimes in the United States occurred because of the offender's religious bias. And regrettably, the FBI reported a 12% increase in religious hate crimes between 2020 and 2021. But as always, you always have to look at the data source to identify if there are any anomalies or inconsistencies. And when this FBI report was examined by Religion Action Center, they discovered that astonishingly, the FBI did not, and I repeat, not include hate crimes occurring in all of California, all of Florida, and the major metros of New York City, Chicago, Phoenix, and of course, Los Angeles. Are you kidding me? Some of the most populous states and cities with some of the highest crime rates are left out of this data. What in the world were they thinking? I mean, I leave it to you to decide if it was intentional so as to understate the attack on religious freedoms. But nevertheless, if the 12% reported increase in religious hate crimes is in the less populated areas, imagine what the real number would be across the United States. And in this undercounted FBI data, the greatest number of religious hate crimes were first anti-Jewish, second anti-Christian, and third anti-Muslim. And for those of you listening out there who are of the Orthodox Christian faith, hate crimes against us represented 3.5% of all religious hate crimes, which, as you know, is a much higher percentage than we represent of the population of people of faith. And I'm not sure why we may be more significantly targeted. And again, remember, those numbers are without taking into account the FBI's staggering omission of states and cities with some of the highest concentrations of people, including a lot of Orthodox folks. So why haven't you heard about any of this massive and increasing crime wave against people of faith? Well, according to research by Catherine Dempsey from my alma mater, Northwestern, it's largely due to the strong media bias against people of faith. For example, a study was published in the Journal of Media and Religion, and it points to partiality between 1980 and 2000. So we're looking at a 2-decade period. Against Christians, and they looked at examining how the nightly television news broadcast reported on fundamentalist Christians in a constantly negative fashion. So for a 2-decade cycle there were constant and repeated evening news broadcasts focusing negatively and characterizing Christians as fundamentalists and people that were perpetrating all kinds of evils of thoughts and opinions and expressions. Now, why might this be? Well, according to a 2007 survey of the Pew Research Center for the People and Press, only 8% of national journalists and 14% of local journalists indicated that they attended a place of worship. So let me repeat that. According to the Pew Research Center, only 8% of national journalists and 14% of local journalists indicated that they attended a place of worship every week or so. Now, no doubt those trends have gotten much worse in the intervening decades, and I'm not here fussing at the journalists, but I'm trying to use that to explain perhaps why there may be a bias at some of the reporting that we see and we hear. And that's just in the United States. I'm on several of the Archon and other research group distribution lists identifying acts of religious persecution, attacks, and interference on a global basis. And the Order of St. Andrew Christian Persecution Report, which if you want to get access to it, just email me at bill@stewardshipcalling.com. But the Order of St. Andrew Christian Persecution Report concluded that by 2014, so this is old data, 90% of Orthodox Christian had been displaced in Iraq. And it goes on to report Christian persecution activities in Iran, China, India, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere. And this doesn't even include the report by the director of the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF International, which is a faith-based legal advocacy organization that protects fundamental religious freedoms. They concluded that's based on the evidence that they say that Christians are, and I quote, bearing the brunt of cancel culture, end quote. Not a day goes by that I don't get emailed or read about some attack on our religious freedoms. Let me just share with you a few examples from just the last several weeks, okay? The Federalist reported about a lawsuit involving a woman in Oregon who was seeking to adopt one of the more than 8,000 children that are in foster care in Oregon. And she was refused because she in turn refused a radical gender dysphoria requirements that were imposed by the folks in Oregon. And she's fighting the industry focused on transforming those confused youth, which is estimated to reach a $5 billion a year industry by the end of this decade. That's how much is going to be spent on trying to transition young people. Then there's the Minnesota proposed legislation that I just read about, and it's intended to enforce a new curriculum in their school systems that's going to be preaching about how the stratification, including by religion, has fueled their race-driven agenda. And then who can forget the Turfenstein 3D video game? I'm sure not many of you play that, but and by the way, TERF, T-E-R-F, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. So the Turfenstein 3D video game, the primary target is to hunt down and kill religious clergy and people of faith. Apparently, that kind of violence and offensiveness is okay. And on top of that, even after Maine lost in the United States Supreme Court in the last term on their law that discriminated against religious schools, they are reportedly still finding other ways to circumvent allowing religious schools to receive the same benefits as other schools receive in the form of tuition reimbursement. And then how about the 303 Creative versus Ellenist case that's currently before the United States Supreme Court? In this case, a graphic designer by the name of Lori Smith is challenging the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act that would force this Christian woman to create wedding websites that are contrary to her earnestly held religious beliefs, that marriage is between one man and one woman. And then, of course, closer to home, there's the Queen of Angels Catholic Bookstore in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, this Christian bookstore welcomes any customer of any perspective to come in. But because of a new ordinance, the Christian Catholic owner of this bookstore is subjected to potentially massive governmental fines if she chooses to exercise her free speech or freedom of religion of her Christian beliefs about man and woman and marriage, and that might make somebody feel uncomfortable or might use the wrong pronoun, and she can be fined for that. Look, I can go on and on with religious freedom issues because this is just from the last couple of weeks, but before I bring on my guest, who's a true constitutional legal scholar, let me take a stab at setting the legal and constitutional stage. Now, Associate Dean and Professor Jacob is going to give me a grade at the end when he comes on here about my brief historical recitation, since he actually wrote and published a book on the separation of church and state. So let me begin by repeating something that I hope will be familiar to each and every one of you. Let me quote: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of their grievances, end quote. I hope you all recognize the exact words of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Sounds pretty clear to me. How about you? Now, about the phrase, the separation of church and state. I bet that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Because you hear about that all the time in the news and the media and everything like that. But the question I have for you is, do you know where that phrase came from? Because I just read to you the First Amendment and it isn't there. So when we start to talk about this phrase of the separation of church and state that you're not going to find in the U.S. Constitution or the Bill of Rights, and you won't find it in any federal law when the country was formed, nor was it a pronouncement by a judicial body like the Supreme Court when our republic was formed. Instead, this now ubiquitous term is so misunderstood, it came out in a letter. Yeah, just a plain old ordinary letter. On New Year's Day in 1802, a fairly new United States president by the name of Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association. It's one of many letters that he exchanged with them. And here are Jefferson's exact words in this infamous letter. And let me quote: believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared their legislature should, quote, make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, end quote. Wait, he didn't actually say separation of church and state. He talked about a metaphorical wall of separation, whatever the heck that means. So how did this random musings of a newly elected president in a private letter to a private religious group get rewritten and become the rallying cry of those who oppose religion? So the first time that I can find Jefferson's phrase creeping into any American jurisprudence, and Professor Jacob will correct me if I'm wrong, was a full 77 years later from when he wrote it in now 1879. And historian Clay Jenkinson, the editor-at-large of Governing, wrote a great summary piece on this topic for their website that was released back last year in 2022. And I hope that you read it. I'll give you a site if you're interested. Shoot me an email at bill@stewardshipcalling.com. But in his article, Jenkinson reports that the 1879 case of Reynolds versus the United States, the Supreme Court denied that the Mormon practice of polygamy was protected by the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court referred to the wall of separation for the very first time, but did not actually use the phrase separation of church and state. Now, the Supreme Court agreed with Reynolds that the free exercise of religion that underlay the founding of the United States, but it also said that the government could regulate actions that violated the state's police powers, and that government officials have a right to regulate behavior as a part of religious practices that are considered, and here's the key words, odious and violate the basic notions of morality, like polygamy back in those days. So there you have it. In 1879, we learned that the state can interfere with religion if the proposed practice is odious or violates basic notions of morality, whatever the heck that means. But what's also important about the Reynolds case is that the right after the majority quoted Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, the court majority opinion states, and let me quote, "Coming as this does from an acknowledged leader of the advocates of the measure, it may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the amendment thus secured." Now, the courts oftentimes have to look at the legislative history of a law to try and ascertain what was the legislative branch thinking about when they created that law. And so the Supreme Court will do that also if they need to interpret something. But in this case, there was no legislative history to review that talked about this whole separation of church and state. So instead, the justices, well-intentioned though they may have been, took a random letter from Thomas Jefferson and ascribed it as the legislative intent of the founders when they drafted the First Amendment. But even the Supreme Court admitted that Jefferson's letter was nothing more than, and here's the word, almost an authoritative declaration. Man, talk about a stretch. Even those of you who aren't lawyers might agree that this is a pretty shaky start to this notion of separation of church and state. So how did an almost authoritative declaration become an accepted jurisprudential matter? It was a full 68 years later, in the 1947 case of Emerson versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court ruled that a New Jersey statute that allocated taxpayer funds to bus children to religious schools was okay constitutionally because it did not breach that, quote, wall of separation, end quote, between church and state. It was a close call. It was only a 5-4 decision, but the majority cited that 68-year-old Reynolds case and said, and let me quote, "Neither a state nor the federal government can, openly or secretly, participate in the affairs of any religious organizations or groups and vice versa." In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a, here we go again, wall of separation between church and state, end quote. But they really went further in setting a kind of a new standard in the very last sentence of the majority opinion, where they concluded, and again, let me quote, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. New Jersey has not breached it here," end quote. Wow. We went from just a simple wall of separation to now a high and impenetrable wall in the 145 years from Jefferson's 1802 letter until the Everson decision in 1947. But the dissenting opinions, the justices that disagreed in the Everson opinion, were the ones who actually started to use the phrase separation between church and state. And they used it several times, and that's how a new phrase found its way into American jurisprudence and common use. In fact, that separation of church and state phrase was thereafter used so often that in that article that Jenkinson, that I cited earlier, what he wrote, and let me quote it, "From this time forward, with slight variations, Jefferson's phrase, wall of separation between church and state, achieved such high legal status in Supreme Court decisions that it could nearly be mistaken for a phrase the founders actually embedded in the Constitution itself, rather than words later the jurists appropriated from a letter by the third president, end quote. I love it. He calls out this judicial principle for what it was: a relatively random phrase used in an entirely inconsequential private letter of a president to a private group. But it would not be for another 38 years before Chief Justice Rehnquist tried to set the historical record straight in a dissenting opinion in Wallace versus Jaffrey in 1985. And in his dissent, Chief Justice Rehnquist said, and again, let me quote, "There is simply no historical foundation for the proposition that the framers intended to build the wall of separation that was constitutionalized in Everson versus Board of Education," end quote. The First Amendment, Rehnquist argued, and let me quote him again, has been expressly frightened out with Jefferson's misleading metaphor for nearly 40 years. Now, a lot more debate on this phrase has occurred in the Supreme Court and jurisprudence, and I'll spare you that tonight. But I love the conclusion that Jenkinson reaches in his article when he says, and again, let me just quote it directly for you: "Just what the founders had in mind in the First Amendment is not altogether clear. Two things are certain, however. First, they wanted every American to be able to practice the religion of their choice without civil reward and without civil penalty. As Jefferson put it in his famous Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom back in 1787, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities," end quote. And so, the separation of church debate remains in full force to the present. Now, in last year's Supreme Court term, thankfully, with a less antagonistic view toward religion, there were several decisions that came down very favorably. So the Carson versus Macon decision in June of 2022, where the court struck down that Maine law that prohibited tax dollars from funding tuition at religious schools that I now just reported to you Maine is trying to circumvent, even though the Supreme Court told them not to. And then a few days later, the Supreme Court released their opinion in a case, Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, where the court ruled that a public high school football coach in the state of Washington was within his First Amendment rights to pray privately at midfield after football games. I have to give you a note of personal privilege that's actually going to connect up with my guest here tonight. I mean, while it actually took Coach Kennedy to go to the Supreme Court to be able to pray by himself at the end of a football game, I'm really blessed in the Doctor of Strategic Leadership program I'm a part of at Regent University that we actually begin and end our classes in prayer. And all the Regent faculty begin and end in prayer, and they invite the students to offer their prayerful reflections also. So it's really great to be in a place where, in this opportunity, where we can actually freely express our religious beliefs, even though we represent folks of various different religious persuasion. But you can rest assured that we've not yet buried President Jefferson's personal opinion about separation of church and state. And so what I tried to provide this very quick glimpse at some of the legal attacks that we're going to start to discuss tonight. But a quick internet search found at least 33 official groups in America specifically fighting against religion. And that's a very incomplete list. I mean, for example, Planned Parenthood wasn't on that list, and yet they fight religion all the time in pursuit of their agenda to support abortion on demand and at any time. The Planned Parenthood website boasts that Planned Parenthood Action Fund is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group backed by more than 7 million activists, donors, and other supporters. Now, when I searched the IRS database, I found out that Planned Parenthood in 2019, so this data is a couple years old, but it's the latest data I could find. In 2019, they had total revenue of $285.6 million. And of that, $263.5 million was in contributions just in that year. How about that for another famous group fighting religion called Freedom from Religion? They say that the history of Western civilization shows us that most social and moral progress has been brought about by persons free from religion. Swing and a miss. Boy, did they get that wrong. So what is FFRF's purpose? They state in their bylaws that their purpose is to promote the constitutional principle of, yes, you guessed it, separation of church and state. They go on to say that their job is to educate the public on matters relating to non-theism. So right from the start, they get it wrong. Since I've already established that the separation of church and state is decidedly not found in the Constitution. But their audited financial statements from 2021 show $10.4 million of net assets. And that had grown, it started out as $10.4 million, but by the end of 2021, it had grown to $25.7 million. Folks, that's a lot of money working against people of religious beliefs in America. And interestingly to me, their advertising expenditures for 2021 alone were $2.5 million. Which means that 30% of all of their expenses were going on advertising and promotion against religion. Let me say that again, 30%, $2.5 million from just this one organization trying to fight an anti-religion message. Look, I've already cited you some of the stats about the strong bias in the media against religion and the significant increase that we're all experiencing in anti-religious hate crimes in the United States, in fact, globally. I could go on with more stats and information about how many groups are trying to end our religious freedoms or impact them or remove them or restrict them in any way. But I want to spend more time with my special guest tonight. So let me introduce him and I'm going to take a break. So I am so blessed tonight to have as my guest Associate Dean and Professor Brad Jacob. And from 2001 to the present, Professor Jacob is the Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Associate Professor and Principal Lecturer at Regent University School of Law. Now, he received the Regent University Faculty Award for Excellence in multiple cycles here, right? And among the other courses he teaches is Constitutional Law 1 and Constitutional Law 2 and Constitutional Criminal Procedure, Foundations of Law, and Nonprofit Tax-Exempt Organizations. These are classes that are all perfectly germane to the topics that we talk about on a frequent basis here. I will tell you that constitutional law was a very challenging class for me when I went through law school about 1 million years ago. But in addition, Professor Jacob is taught at the Hangdong International Law School in South Korea, the Regent University College of Arts and Sciences, Patrick Henry College, and Geneva College, where he also served as Associate Dean of the School of Law. From 2001 to 2001, Professor Jacob served as the Executive Director of the Justice Fellowship, Prison Fellowship Ministries. But here's the other incredible reason why I'm so glad that Brad Jacob is going to be my guest here tonight. From 1988 to 1993, he served as the Christian Legal Society's Executive Director and CEO from May 1991 to October 1993. So he has this long tenure with the Christian Legal Society, starting out as Executive Director and moving up to CEO from 1988 to the end of 1993. And he started out as the Director of Attorney and Law Student Ministries in March of 1989 to 91. Then he was the General Counsel from 1989 to 1991 and Staff Attorney, and went on into the Center for Law and Religious Freedom and ultimately became the Managing Editor of the Religious Freedom Reporter. Now, for those of you that don't know, CLS, the Christian Legal Society, is a national leader in the lobbying efforts to pass Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. And for those of you of the Orthodox persuasion, I know some of my colleagues in the Orthodox legal communities are listening here tonight, the Orthodox Christian Legal Society, or the Orthodox Christian Lawyers Association, joined the Christian Legal Society in subsequent years to go and have our conferences contemporaneously with each other. And we were blessed to have several of our Orthodox federal judges appear as speakers, as well as a large number of panels. So the Orthodox legal community and the Christian Legal Society have a close relationship. Now, before all of this distinguished career in academia and at the Christian Legal Society, Brad was an attorney at Piper Marbury, which is now DLA Piper, one of the largest global law firms. He was based in Baltimore, Maryland. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. And one of the funnest thing I have about him is that he actually got a perfect score on the law school admissions test. And when I was chatting with a current board member at Regent University who was a graduate of the law school, he said, "I can't believe it. Somebody actually got a perfect score on the LSATs." But Brad also received a BA in political science, summa cum laude, from the University of Delaware, where among many honors, and many other activities. He was also in the marching band, something that's very near and dear to my heart, having spent a lot of time. Professor Jacob has written extensively, and he's got an unbelievable speaking list. He's done programs like this and many others. He had a radio show himself. But among the scholarly articles that he wrote that I think are very, very germane, and we're actually going to talk about him tonight, is a great article that he wrote on living out my calling. And I have linked that on my website for tonight's program because we're going to talk about that. And he also wrote a very impressive book on the separation of church and state. So that's why he's going to give me a grade on my short recitation of this deep topic. Brad also has a very extensive array of volunteer and community service accomplishments, including serving on the board of elders at Crossroads Church and the Christian Legal Society Advisory Council. And not surprisingly, he's also participated in numerous amicus briefs before the United States Supreme Court and a whole variety of circuit courts of appeal. And some of the most critical recent religious freedom cases, such as Whole Woman's Health versus Cole and the Obergefell versus Hodges and Brunner versus Armstrong. So we've got a lot to talk about, but I'm going to take a breath now. We're going to take a short break. And when I return, I'm going to fully explore some of these religious freedom and liberty topics with my incredibly special guest, Associate Dean Professor Brad Jacob. Remember, if you have any questions, you can call us at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Okay, let's take a short break and we'll be right back.
Bill will be right back, but the lines are open if you want to ask a question or offer your thoughts. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Jesus' last words to his disciples were, "Go and make disciples of all the nations." Unfortunately, many parishes are struggling to follow this commandment. In Reclaiming the Great Commission, Father Evan Armitage offers a roadmap to help us get back on track. Relying on his 20 years of parish experience, Holy Scripture, and insights from research and his visits with churches across the U.S., he discusses how you and your community can implement changes that will transform, revitalize, and renew your parish. You'll learn how to diagnose and remove the barriers you face, deal with resistance to change, define what a healthy parish looks like, lead with purpose, and create a parish health plan. Written for clergy, council members, ministry leaders, small groups, and all committed parishioners, this book will help any church in its journey to reclaim the Great Commission. Purchase it today at store.ancientfaith.com.
Stewardship Calling is back, and we are ready for your call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here again is Bill Marianes.
So welcome back to Stewardship Calling and our first Wednesday series where we're exploring some of the critical issues that are facing Christians in the areas of religious freedom. And I have a very, very special guest tonight, the Associate Dean and Professor Brad Jacob. And we want to hear your questions, and you feel free to call in and get an expert opinion, finally, not just from me, but from somebody who knows this stuff. You can call it at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. So, Brad, are you here?
Well, I think I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you loud and clear, brother. I guess Excellent. You're at the law school, huh?
I'm at my desk at Regent Law School. Yes, I am.
Okay. Always working late at night. All right, look, there is so much more to a person than their CV. So I want to give you an opportunity to share a little more color commentary about your upbringing, your background, or anything else about your personal journey that you'd like to share.
Well, I was raised outside of Chicago and in what was then a little cow town called Naperville in the Boondocks in the 1960s.
I know it well.
Today it's a kind of a big metropolis itself, but
yeah, it's its own metroplex.
Grew up there a long time ago. Was part of a church. Today I'm a Southern Baptist, so a different worship style than probably most of your listeners. But I was raised in kind of a high church Lutheran congregation that never clicked with me. I did the thing, I was there, but it really didn't become a faith that had meaning in my life till my family moved to Baltimore when I was in high school, and then I went to the University of Delaware, and that's where I found Christ. And campus ministry folks there connected with me and explained the gospel in a way that I'd never heard it before. And I entered on that faith journey that I've been walking on now for 45 plus years. So that's where it started for me, although I had a churched upbringing, but it wasn't one that had made personal faith in my life. Mm-hmm. So I graduated from Delaware, went to the University of Chicago Law School, studied under some pretty well-known people. My favorite professor was my constitutional law professor, but he didn't stay around too long. The year after he taught me, he quit and went got a different gig somewhere else. But Antonin Scalia was a pretty good professor when I had him.
He was okay.
Constitutional law, yeah.
I can't imagine what that must have been like to have him teaching that. That just blows my mind to think about that.
But we didn't know he was going to be a Supreme Court justice. He was just a professor, but he was a good one. I mean, if you ever saw him during oral arguments on the Supreme Court, he's a very engaging fellow. He was he's with the Lord now, of course, but he very witty. Could be a little sharp-edged in his humor sometimes, but never ever boring. And that's the way his classroom was. I mean, he kept us on our toes. He was a tough teacher, but he made it fun. He made it interesting, and I try to do a little bit of that with my students as well.
Is it fair to say that he, in some way, helped influence you in the career path that you ended up doing now? Is there some connection there?
I think he was among many influences. He laid some roots there. Certainly got me excited about constitutional. Well, I was already excited about constitutional law, and honestly, I think most Christians who go to law school have a passion about constitutional law. Certainly, most of our Regent students do.
Right.
This is a Christ-centered law school, and an awful lot of them come here and they want to work for ADF or ACLJ. Right. They want to be involved in constitutional law. So I already had that passion, but he certainly helped build that in me. I never thought I'd be able to do it for a career, because it's, being a constitutional lawyer, you can't just sort of open up a little storefront law office.
I can't see it. I can't see a television ad. 1-800, if you have a constitutional law, call Brad. It's like, that doesn't work, right?
Well, the one almost universal when you're dealing with these public advocacy cases, including religious liberty or pro-life, whatever they may be, the one almost universal is the client can't pay the bill. Yeah. So you can't be depending on that to put food on the table. So
good point.
There's a couple ways to be involved in this. You either work for an organization that raises money to pay your salary, and that's what happened to me with Christian Legal Society, or you do another kind of law practice to pay the bills, a tent making kind of career, if you will, right. and then kind of do some advocacy stuff on the side. But I never dreamed I would become a church state lawyer. I never dreamed I would that I would be a law professor or associate dean of a law school. None of that was on my radar screen at the time. So got married just as I was graduating from law school. I actually got married between my last exam and commencement. And,
was that planned, or that's kind of like
had a short honeymoon, and we're back in time for graduation.
Wow.
And that amazing, wonderful woman has stayed with a crazy lawyer for 40 years now. So I am so grateful.
God bless you
for what she has done in my life. We have raised and are raising a total of 9 children. 5 of them.
That's staggering. When I first heard that, I thought, boy, that's a real patient person to take through that kind of process. What's that like? I mean, that's got to be its own story there.
Well, we didn't set out to have 9 children. We didn't think it was going. We actually started out with infertility at the beginning of our marriage, and we ended up after 7 years adopting our first child.
Awesome.
And then God basically took the infertility away, and went on over the next few years to have 5 birth children, which seems like a lot, but actually in the homeschool community, it's not that unusual to have right. big families. People ask me, they'll say, are you Catholic or are you Mormon? I'll say, I'm just a passionate Protestant. That's all. And
Okay.
so we had 5 birth children, and then at the end, after we had moved here to Virginia Beach, when I took the job at Regent, we realized we probably weren't going to have any more birth kids, but we weren't sure God was telling us our family was done. And since then, we've adopted 3 special needs kids. So our youngest 3 all have pretty serious physical and mental disabilities, and so they'll be with us for all of their lives, or all of our lives.
Right.
And they bring so much joy, just so much delight into my life. I just can't tell you how much people act sometimes as if we're making some great sacrifice to have, disabled kids that we took in by choice, not by accident. And they bless me so much more than I bless them. It's really amazing. So
what a powerful statement. That's to y'all's credit, but that is a beautiful, beautiful sentiment, and something that I hope people listen to as they hear and think about the fact that, yes, obviously, if you have a child that's born with a disability, my sister was, and things of that nature. I mean, that there can be some thoughts of challenge here, but here you are testifying to the beauty and the joy that they can bring in your lives.
Yeah, it is a wonderful thing. Kids are always a joy, even though sometimes, they put you through hard things. I've got some adult kids that have put me through some difficult things, having to live with some difficult things, but it's a joy. But those special needs kids, just there's an innocence, there is so much delight in the little things of life. My son, who's about to turn 20, has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so
oh my gosh,
he can't walk. He's in a wheelchair. He's losing the use of the upper half of his body. It makes it difficult to lift a cup to his lips at this point. And he also, because his biomom drank and used crack heavily through the pregnancy, has very significant mental disabilities as well. He's kind of a perpetual 3 or 4 year old. And so here's this kid who started out being able to run and play like other kids, and now he's in his late teens, and he's confined to a wheelchair, and we have to pick him up and move him in and out of his bed, and he can't go out and play. And he finds so much joy and delight in coloring, or playing a video game on the computer, or, just the little stuff in life. And I look at my body at my age, some things are starting to break down. It doesn't work as well as it did in my 30s or 40s. And I have a tendency to feel sorry for myself. And then I look at Benjamin and I say, good grief, if this kid can go through what he goes through, and all the doctors and the poking and the prodding and the medical equipment and with life, what earthly grounds do I have to complain about my life?
Yeah, no, listen, the strongest person I've ever known is my sister. I mean, she's just, what she's overcome with her disabilities and stuff like that is just exemplary. So I can share that. The other thing that I think is really uplifting, I mean, there's a lot uplifting about what you just said. One of the things that's uplifting is, one of the things we've talked a lot in some of the other episodes of this program, is the challenge of losing our children in their faith journey as they go off to college. And your story is the exact opposite of that. It kind of rekindled it. It kind of grounded it in a good way. So that's a good story too, I think.
It is. But then I'll tell you, moving ahead a generation, not all of my kids are walking with Jesus these days. And even though we raised them in that strong home environment, and the reality is God doesn't have grandchildren. He reaches to each of us, individually. We get to make a choice to have faith or not to have faith. And that's, all I can do is trust God for my kids, and be the best example for them I have. And some of them who had moved away earlier in their lives have now kind of turned back, and so we're all a journey, right? We're all a
Yeah,
work in progress. And
and listen, you know, you've demonstrated it in your own life. I mean, you came back to it, you know, kind of in college, but others may come later in life. So, you know, and that's an important part of it. And I think, you know, to parents out there who, you know, maybe struggling with where their children are in their respective faith journeys, and that is, you know, I love, you know, your expression is exactly right. God has individual children, and we are all his children, including your children. So just have faith and keep prayerfully doing it. Now, along this incredible journey of yours, you had a lot of fascinating experiences as not only as a Christian, but as a lawyer. I mean, your time at the CLS, your time at the, you know, Center for Law and Religious Freedom, the director of the Justice Fellowship policy. Can you just share a little bit about those experiences and how they have helped shape your living a calling to use your God-given legal abilities to pursue this work for Christ's kingdom here?
Absolutely. I love talking about calling. I can talk about calling all night if you want to.
You're on the right program, buddy, because that's what it's called. You know, it's all about calling. I'm with you all the way. I'm all the way with you.
So I started out after law school. I took a job with I'd spent my high school years in Baltimore, and my wife and I decided we wanted to return. And I took a job with the biggest sort of blue blood law firm in Baltimore, Piper and Marbury, which is now DLA Piper. And I was there, and I practiced municipal finance for 5 years. I was a document drafter and on big financings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I learned to be a very good, careful lawyer. The partners, you know, I was getting to be a senior associate, and the partners were putting a lot of confidence in me. But the farther I got into that, the more I kept having this nagging feeling that this wasn't what God had sent me to law school for.
Really?
And that I didn't really want to spend the rest of my career doing this. Number one, very demanding. I mean, big law is a tough life. We didn't have any kids at that point, but I'm thinking, man, if I had kids, I wouldn't be seeing very much of them. It was hard enough for my wife and me to make time together. I go into work on Saturday and sometimes Sunday, and she'd go with me, and she'd be my secretary, you know, and hang out at the office and make photocopies for me. And, you know, it's pre-computer days.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, more and more we both had this sense that it wasn't working, but I wasn't willing to go down that path because I thought, I'm the provider. I've got to you know, be here for her and for kids eventually. And I've got, you know, I'm a rising associate in a big, well-paying law firm, and I can't turn my back on that. And one day she came to me and said, Brad, I've been getting in my daily time in the scripture and in prayer, says I keep getting this message over and over again, not to hang on to the material things. And she said, I just want you to know, if God calls you to leave Piper and do something else and it makes less money, we'll make it work. You don't need to feel like this is about the money. And
so she was kind of like an angel that showed up to deliver this important message to you, right? I mean, that's
absolutely, and gave me permission to think about the thing that I'd been trying really hard not to think about. And that fall, we ended up, we went to the Christian Legal Society National Conference. I'd been a CLS member since law school, but I'd never really been involved. I paid the dues and read the magazine. But they were doing a conference at a Christian conference center not far from us, a place called Sandy Cove in Northeast Maryland, and we loved it there. And I said, well, I don't know a lot about CLS, but let's go to the conference. And we got there, and in God's providence, we got there right when the two of us were just really, really wrestling with, what do I do with my career?
Yeah.
And I met the then executive director, CEO of Christian Legal Society, was a man named Sam Erickson.
Right.
And met Sam, and he spent all kinds of time with us that weekend. And it wasn't later till I was in that job and realized, wow, during the national conference, he took that much time to invest in me. That's kind of amazing, because there were about 1 billion other things that he had to do at the same time. But he really talked through his experience. He'd been in a big LA firm, and left that to become first executive pastor of a church, and then ended up with CLS, and really helped us accept this idea that it's not crazy to walk away from all the stuff that our profession tells us we are supposed to seek,
Right.
and to give up the money and the partnership and the prestige to do the thing that maybe God has made me to do. And so I left that conference convinced that I was going to leave the law firm. And I actually even told the partners I worked for, I said, listen, I don't want to blindside you, but I'm really thinking God is calling me into something else. And I'm looking, and I don't know when and how that's going to happen. But I wanted them to know as I started on that path.
Stop for just a second. I don't want to interrupt your story. What was that conversation like? What kind of reactions did you get?
They were actually very accepting. There was there weren't very many serious Christians in this law firm, but the senior partner of the firm was also the head of my public finance group, and he was a Roman Catholic, and he had always kind of tried to protect me a little bit. If he loaned me out to another partner, he'd say, well, don't give Brad work he has to do on Sunday.
Good for him.
He prefers to work hard the other 6 days of the week. And
right.
just don't call him up at 10 o'clock Saturday night and say, hey, I need this for Monday. And he'd always been very supportive. And his response was basically, how can I argue with God? If you're telling me God is calling you away. They did try to convince me to stay. And this, you'll appreciate this, but this was back in the early 80s. The late 80s at that point, in 1988. And in those days, law firms, basically, you were either a partner or you were an associate on track to be partner, or you were gone. There were no other
Up and out, as we used to say.
Yes, exactly. But they wanted me to stay. And so they said, look, we'll create a different position. If part of the problem is that this firm and being a partner in this firm, down the road is wants too much of you, and you want to have more for your family and those things, we'll take you off partnership track, and we'll keep your current salary for now. We'll see what happens, and it'll be part-time. So you'll work Monday through Friday, 8 to 5.
Oh, wow. That was very progressive.
Only in a law firm only in a law firm is that called part-time.
Oh yeah, that is part-time. Yeah, come on, what are you talking about, man? That's not a full week's worth.
But and I tell this to my students, and the lesson I'll give to them is, they did that for me because I was doing what I was doing with excellence. I didn't use being a Christian as an excuse to be half good. I did it as unto the Lord, did my best. And so they kind of created what today we call the mommy track. Today, there are lots of different kinds of positions like this in law firms. But in 1988, they really went out on a limb for me. And we did it for a little while I was doing job seeking. I'm not sure it would have worked, just because I think they would have stuck to it, but I would have had a lot of trouble walking out the door at 5 o'clock and saying, hey, this deal didn't get finished. I'm going to drop it on your desk, because one of my friends who's got 3 deals of his own going on. Right. I'm not sure I could have done that. Yeah. But in the middle of all this, Sam Erickson called me back and said, hey, Brad, I just had a staff attorney resign from the Center for Law and Religious Freedom. Would you like to come work for CLS doing religious liberty work? I was like, let's see, municipal bonds or church state law. Which of these sounds more exciting to me? Yeah. He told me the salary, and that had me thinking, because it was
there was a little bit of a wake-up call, I'm sure.
Huge cut from what I'd been making. They actually ended up hiring my wife too, so that we could get 2 incomes out of the deal. And I went to work for CLS. Was there for a year in the Center for Law and Religious Freedom, and that's when I first became a church state lawyer. Then I was the director of attorney and law student ministries for about 2 years. So that was kind of a pastor job. I put on the conferences. I traveled and spoke to lawyer groups and student groups a lot around the country. And then after I'd been in that role for 2 years, Sam left to create a new organization called Advocates International, which networks Christian lawyers around the world.
Globally,
and the board asked me to take his place as executive director, which is the CEO of CLS, Christian Legal Society. It's a little bit unusual because it's a membership organization. The president is a volunteer, and the staff CEO is called the executive director. So I did that job for about 3 years until I figured out that it was mostly a fundraising job, and that's not my gift.
There you go.
And at that point, there was an effort to start a new Christian law school, a little place called Geneva College in Western Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, a little Presbyterian school. Lynn Buzzard, who was another former CLS executive director, was leading the effort, and they hired me to be the on-campus guy. So that was when I started doing college teaching and putting on programs and things, trying to lay the groundwork for a Christian law school at Geneva College, which eventually, after 5 years there, eventually didn't happen. The college was unable to raise the kind of money that it takes to start a law school, because it takes a lot of money to start a law school. And the campus community there, the board, the faculty, there was not a unity of vision. There were those who wanted the law school because they wanted Geneva to become a major national Christian university. And there were others who were very happy just being a little liberal arts college for Reformed Presbyterian kids. And so they weren't anywhere near being able to have the funding we needed to make the law school happen. So I left that when was that? That would have been 1998, and was hired by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association to create a new college, which I did. Created a school called Patrick Henry College in Northern Virginia, and I was the founding provost and dean there, getting that school off the ground. And left a couple years later, spent a little bit of time with Prison Fellowship Ministries, and then God worked an absolute miracle to bring me to Regent Law School. But the interesting part of the story for me, the most interesting, is, I never could have envisioned any of it in advance.
Yeah.
And every time I made one of these career moves, I was convinced that this was the place God had been bringing me to.
Yeah.
Now, Regent, maybe it's going to stick, because I'm about to turn 65 and I've been here for 22 years. Maybe this is going to be a keeper until I can't
maybe
work
you found
anymore.
a real job, right?
Yeah, maybe. My father, when he was still with us, used to describe my career path as downward mobility, because every time I changed jobs, it went with a pay cut. Each one I'd go in thinking, this is it. This is where I'm going. And then after a few years, God would work things. So I said, no, I need to go again. I need to make another move. And the idea that the calling, career calling, vocational calling is not a one-time make a decision and it's all done. It's a very dynamic process, just like the rest of our Christian life, right? Where God is always working in us in new ways and taking us to new places we haven't been. And so each one of these zigs and zags, I'm ending up, what am I doing? I'm in a Christian ministry. I'm trying to start a law school. I'm starting a college. I'm doing all these things that I never thought I would do. And at this point in my life, I can look back and see so many of the connections.
Right.
Not all of them. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more when I get to heaven that I'll be able to see that I can't see now, but I can see, my gosh, when I was there, I learned that. Right. And when I was here, I learned how to do this. And when I was there, I made those connections, people who've been important in my life ever since and who opened doors. And, when I was at Geneva trying to start, first when I was at CLS and I was at Geneva starting trying to start the law school, I got to know Mike Ferris, who ran Homeschool Legal Defense. He's the one who hired me to start the college, and all these things just, there's a path there that God had it all figured out in advance. And all I can try to do is best I can discern his will and take the next step,
Yeah,
but
strap on the seatbelt and just go for the ride.
go for the ride.
Yeah, the one that I always cite too, and he was not a man of faith, so he didn't quite get the faith component of it. But after he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Steve Jobs did a famous commencement speech at Stanford University. He only made 3 points, but second point he made was that you can never connect the dots of your life by looking forward. You can only connect them by looking backward. And that's really the point that you're bringing out here. And I've shared it with my listeners on, I didn't know why a million years ago. And when I got my MBA in law school and I studied strategic planning, I had no idea that God had in mind for me, 40 years later to actually be able to use that discipline to help churches. And so for everybody listening, I think I want you to listen to Brad's testimonial and understand that you have to have faith that God has you on a journey, and you need to have discernment so you can figure out what that next step is versus the ones that really aren't the right ones. But don't be reluctant to take that next step. And this is a segue. I want to segue over you. I'm going to jump ahead here. You wrote an incredible article in the Journal of Christian Legal Thought called "Living Out My Calling." And I highly encourage people to do it. I've got a link on my website to that. But you said in there something that I thought was really, really powerful when you talked about for 27 years. And you said, I've gone to work every day knowing that I am where God wants me to be, doing what God made me to do, and sharing the journey with colleagues whom I love. And I don't think I've heard a more powerful support, and it's just really trying to underscore the faith journey that you're on and how it's done for you. So kind of summarize, if you don't mind, just the thought processes, because in that article, you were pretty clear about, how you moved from various different places where Christianity was not welcome as a lawyer and otherwise to where you are right now. And talk a little bit about this whole notion of calling that I think is so important for people to understand and appreciate.
Yeah, first, I want to be clear. I don't view the move from, a secular law firm into Christian ministry as being sort of the defining attribute of calling.
Right.
I have wonderful Christian friends who work in law firms and work in secular corporations and work in government and things that are not faith oriented, and they are living out their calling. I mean, the calling is so unique. It's who am I? What are the gifts that God has given me? What are the experiences that have played in my life up to this point? What are my passions? What do I love doing? Scripture says that, that God wants to give us the desires of our heart. You got to be a little careful with that because, the devil can mess with our desires, and the world can mess with our desires, and our own sin nature can mess with our desires. But if we're walking with Christ and we're prayerfully seeking Him in the Scriptures and our prayer life, I really believe God is going to help us find that place where we can be a round peg and a round hole, doing the thing that we were most created to do. And I'll tell my students, I say, don't settle for less. Don't put yourself in a career just because it pays a lot of money. Yeah, there is ultimately no satisfaction in that. And you'll be one of those people who gets to the end of their life and say, gosh, look at how many cars I have and look at how many houses I have. And, my life was really awful. and you don't want to end up there. I would much rather, live on a professor's salary and have a lot of old furniture and old cars and have this delight of saying, I'm impacting young lives. I'm having an effect for the kingdom. And I really believe that every Christian should be making that our standard. We need to not settle for anything less than a career walk that is in line with God's best for our life. Now, sometimes for a short time, you just have to do what you have to do to keep a roof over your head and pay the bills and put food on the table. So I understand that. And I understand that you may be in a situation where, okay, the best I can do is, drive for Uber or flip burgers or whatever I'm going to do because right now I've just got to do. But our vision has to be on something better than that. Our vision as believers has to be on saying, God made me for a purpose, and that kingdom purpose. It sounds like I'm quoting Chariots of Fire. That kingdom. I won't do my Scottish accent.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you do the accent? That'd be great.
I do it, but I'm told it's not very good. So I probably shouldn't do my Eric Liddell impression. And probably a lot of your listeners are too young to remember Chariots of Fire anyway. But
it's a classic. They ought to go watch it then, darn it.
it is an awesome movie. But that idea that Eric Liddell says in the movie, and I believe said in real life, when I run, I feel his pleasure. Mm-hmm. Jenny, when I run, I feel his pleasure. Right? That's what he's
there. You go. You did it. Great.
So, when I teach my students, I feel his pleasure. When I do my work as an administrator so that the program runs well and things are happening, I feel his pleasure. I feel like I'm using my gifts and my talents and my passions together to do something that's constructive for the kingdom. And some people can do that in a secular law firm or in the government or in other, it doesn't have to be a calling like my calling. But I've known people, in the law, there are so many different kinds of careers.
Yeah.
And you often don't know until you kind of get in there. I'll tell students, use summer to get an internship with a judge, with a law firm. And you're not going to be doing anything particularly important because you're just a student. But you want to see what this is like.
Yeah.
You spend a summer clerking for a family court judge, and you look at what happens in family court, and you're either going to say, ew,
never
that's
again,
awful, or I don't want to be around that, or you're going to say, goodness, the people in this court are at their lowest spot in life. Their whole life is falling apart, and they need ministry. And they need a counselor at law who can also hear them, who can speak encouragement into their life, who can help them if they're going through a divorce, maybe help them reconcile. And if you can't do that, help them end it well so the children don't turn into pawns. Right. There's so many ministry opportunities, and it's just going to depend on the individual. Some people will feel called into that as a ministry, and other people will just say, no, I'm not going near that.
Yeah, right,
and it's pretty much anywhere else, any other kind of career, you're going to get a sense, is this something that God has really given me a passion for, that excites me? And I love when people find that vision. We're really, really big on that at Regent Law School, is helping our students not just be trained as lawyers, but also to be really focused on that vision of how can I use my career, not just to make money, but to really impact the world for Christ and live out the stuff that I was made to do.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. So, I survived in big law a little bit longer than you did, but I like you said, I use that as an opportunity to do a lot of things for the churches and things of that nature. But to me, one of the most amazing times was I retired early so I can do this full-time free church ministry. And when I went to my clients and I went to all my partners, and when you're in management, that's another level of challenge. And I said to them, I'm leaving. I'm going to, give you kind of a year to transition all the clients and all the relationships. I'm leaving in a year. And they said, where are you going? And I told them what I'm going to do. And they said, well, how are you going to make any money? I said, I'm going to work for free. And they said, are you serious? And I said, yeah, I'm serious. and then what was interesting was it fell into two buckets, Brad. So there were those that said, how can you leave or walk away from all of this? And I would look at them and I'd say, I'm not walking away from anything. I'm running to what I was called to do. And I'd get these quizzical looks back, right? And then there were so many people of very different, including some of my Jewish partners and whatnot, who, when I said it to them, I could see in their eyes, and then they shared it in their hearts, that that's something they wanted to do and something they wish they could do. And they weren't quite ready to get there. And it's interesting to see that tension that exists in some people's lives where, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful for any of my wonderful partners that kind of didn't get it and are still, churning the billable hours and whatnot. And that's fine for them. That's great. God bless. Right. But so many people now that I've started to see make that next journey and make that next step. And I'll get these calls from people saying, okay, I'm fixing to retire now. Let's have some time about figuring out what am I supposed to do, and it's a different ministry that I'm in sometimes. And I bet you do it a lot too with some of the students that you've had over the decades, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's counterintuitive. It's a kingdom that's not of this world. And it's not always, we live in this world. And so we have to make a living. I'd love to be able to do things that I don't need to get paid for at all. And just, look for ministry opportunities. And, and I can't do that. I've still got kids at home. I've got disabled kids at home. I need income.
Needs a little bit of help here. Yeah.
He does. But to have a career that is itself ministry, and to know, if I was a partner at DLA Piper today, I'd be making probably, 20, 30 times as much money as I make now. I don't want it. I don't want to do that. I want to do this because it's what brings me joy. Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm hoping that everybody takes away from your great testimony. I'm so thankful for you for sharing that. In that, look, folks, there's nothing wrong with a career or a job, or whatever the case may be. As I kind of jokingly referred to him, Christ was a carpenter for a while, right? But at the same, Peter was a fisherman, right? But at the same time, there is a moment in time, or multiple moments in time, when you're going to start to feel the Lord working in you, and that's a time to kind of lean into that and not try to walk away from that, because there'll be extraordinary opportunities. And look, I don't think you're going to starve. So no matter what happens, I think there'll be plenty of opportunities. And when you are finally ready to do that, let me know. I got a lot of free church work for you to do. Okay. So I'll hire you in the free church work. So look, here's what we're going to do, partner, because you've been really great. We're going to take a short break right now, give you a chance to catch your breath here. And then we're going to come back and hit some really hard topics. I'm going to lay the questions for you in advance so you'll be thinking about it. But when we get back, I want you in 10 minutes or less to teach in practical and accessible terminology an entire course in the First Amendment. Okay, you got 10 minutes to teach everything that these listeners need to know about the First Amendment as it relates to religious freedom. We'll leave the freedom of the press for somebody else. And then what I really want you to also do is share with people what you see from your perspective, because you're studying it all day long. What are some of the 3 to 5 of the most important legal issues, cases, or constitutional matters that you think that we as Christians need to understand that can impact our daily lives? Okay, so be thinking about that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short break right now. When we return, we're going to explore those great topics about religious freedom and liberty and stuff like that with our special guest tonight, Associate Dean Professor Brad Jacob. Remember, if you want to ask him any questions, you got an expert now. Feel free to call in at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Let's take a short break and we'll be right back.
Bill will be right back, but the lines are open if you want to ask a question or offer your thoughts. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
New from Ancient Faith Publishing.
Arise, O God, the gospel of Christ's defeat of demons, sin, and death, written by Andrew Stephen Damick. This book is not a sales pitch. I hope that instead it will be an authentic, true proclamation of the gospel. How or whether you respond to it is important, but I'm not going to make a marketing appeal to you at the end. Knowing what the gospel is and being able to teach it to someone else does not require that you know everything in this book. But by the end of it, you should know what a gospel is, why there is a gospel at all, what the gospel is, and what the response to it requires. Arise, O God, the gospel of Christ's defeat of demons, sin, and death.
Now available as an audiobook at audible.com.
Stewardship Calling is back, and we are ready for your call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here again is Bill Marianes.
Well, welcome back to Stewardship Calling in the first Wednesday program, where we're exploring some of the critical issues that are facing Christians in the area of religious freedom with my special guest, the Associate Dean and Professor of Constitutional Law and other topics at Regent University, Brad Jacob. Remember, if you really want to ask him any questions, you can call it 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. All right, folks, you are going to get a full legal career education in 10 minutes or less. Right, about the First Amendment's relationship with the freedom of religion and stuff like that. And this is such a complex and critical topic nowadays. I'm always looking for an expert to come and explain it in practical terms. So take it away, Professor Jacob. Teach us.
10 minutes. I don't usually finish my opening jokes in 10 minutes. But
Me neither.
We'll give it a shot.
Okay.
So the original Constitution, as it was ratified, only said one thing about religion. It said there can be no religious test for public office. That was it. But we get into the first Congress, and they added the Bill of Rights. Congress actually submitted 12 amendments to the states for ratification. They only ratified 10 of those, which became our first 10 amendments. And church state lawyers are always glad about that, because we like to say that religious liberty is the first liberty because it's the first thing in the First Amendment. If they ratified all 12, it would have been the first thing in the Third Amendment. And third liberty just doesn't sound nearly as cool as saying it's the first liberty.
Yeah, we did good.
So First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And we typically break that into two parts. We say, okay, there's the non-establishment clause, and then there's the free exercise clause. Both of those originally only applied to the federal government. The Bill of Rights, as it was enacted, only binds the federal government. There's a complex process involving the 14th Amendment and something called substantive due process that I'm not going to go into now. If you want to come back to that sometime, we can. But
I never want to hear that phrase again. Of the things that I never really could comprehend in con law, that was one of them. So you've triggered a bad memory. We're going to skip over that. And we're going to get to the fact. We're going to conclude that.
So bottom line is both these provisions apply to the states as well as to the federal government. It's actually tricky with non-establishment because the establishment clause was a federalism provision. It said Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which meant no national religion and no national interference with state-established churches, which there were still some at that time. So when the Supreme Court, through this complex way, made it apply against the states, they essentially changed the meaning of the Establishment Clause and made it say no government in the United States may establish a religion. So you got establishment, you got free exercise. The Establishment Clause, is often reduced to that word picture that you discussed so well in your introduction, the separation of church and state, which I actually think is not a bad description, not a bad word picture, if you mean institutional separation.
Bingo.
If you mean the government doesn't control the church doesn't control the government. But this got way off its mark in the 1960s and 70s. The founders knew what an established church was. They knew what an established religion was. It meant you pay taxes to pay the pastor, and the government will tell the church what the liturgy should look like. And if you're not in the right church on Sunday morning, you could go to jail. It was those kinds of things. It was an established government coercion kind of church. But in the 60s and 70s, the court seized on that wall of separation metaphor and started almost turning it into don't ever express faith in the public forum. If you want to be a believer, you can do that on Sunday morning. And I'm a Baptist. I get Wednesday night too. But other than that,
hey, we got a lot more. Listen, if you're ready to make the Orthodox journey, I can fill up the rest of your weeknights with church services too. Okay, so when you want to get into some serious church, brother, let me know. Okay,
I will absolutely let you know.
Right.
So but the idea was, if you're in the public life, if you're arguing for legislation, if you're doing something in court, if you're in the public square. Richard John Newhouse was a Lutheran pastor who became a Catholic priest and wrote a lot about topics of the intersection of culture and faith. And he wrote a great little book called The Naked Public Square, about this idea that you just have to put away your values and your beliefs and pretend you're this sort of secular robot when you come into the public arena. And there was just some terrible law being made in that period. The good news about the Establishment Clause is that the court in recent years has moved away from that. They are no longer looking to strike down everything that possibly exists that suggests that maybe God exists.
Right.
Some of the public displays,
all the Ten Commandments in the courthouses and all that stuff, right?
And the nativity scenes outside the city hall at Christmas, and there's just some crazy case law out there. The nativity scenes, we church state lawyers referred to that line of cases as the plastic reindeer rule, which is, if you want to have baby Jesus in a manger, there's got to be Rudolph nearby and Susie Snowflake, because if it's all by itself, it's unconstitutional. But if you can stick the Grinch in close proximity, then it's all okay. Just insane stuff. Justice Scalia, in one of his opinions, referred to it as interior decorating, being performed by judges. It was crazy,
absurd.
But a lot of that hostility is no longer there in the Supreme Court, and the court is much more turning back to an original understanding, which is, it's an establishment if you're being made to do something, if you're being made to violate your conscience. If there's, there was an important case a couple of years ago involving this Peace Cross up in Bladensburg, Maryland, that was a memorial to World War I dead in the shape of a cross, because a cross is very commonly used as a way of honoring the dead without regard to what their beliefs are. And,
correct.
And indeed, some of the soldiers whose names are on the plaque on that cross are Jewish. We're Jewish, so it's, nobody thought that it was, we're putting this up to make everybody be Christians. And the Supreme Court looked at that and said, yeah, that's right. It is a Christian symbol, but it also has another meaning, which is a broader societal meaning. And bottom line, no one's harmed by the cross. If you don't like it, you can walk by.
Yeah, don't look at it. Yeah, right.
No church has been established. You're not being taxed. You're not forced to do anything. And so this is the direction that the current court is going, and it's a very positive one for the Establishment Clause. Free exercise has been a little bit of a different walk. Free exercise, in some of the early cases, the court really wasn't sure what it meant. You mentioned earlier the Reynolds case, the Mormon polygamy case back in the 1800s.
Right.
And the court there at one point essentially said free exercise means you can believe whatever you want, but the government can always regulate your conduct.
Yeah.
Well, if that's all free exercise means, it doesn't mean anything.
That's right.
The government can't tell you what to think. Gee, thanks.
Yeah.
That's not much of a constitutional protection.
Although again, not related to this, but I mean, I've been watching, and I know you have too, that in Britain and the United Kingdom, where they're arresting clergy people because they are praying outside of an abortion center. And they're suggesting that, if you admit the fact that you are praying, then that's violating their rules. And it's just mind-blowing. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to digress.
It is mind-blowing. So when I lay this out for my students, I say, think of a line that indicates the possible meanings of what is the free exercise of religion. The least it could mean, the least possible meaning is Reynolds. You can believe whatever you want, but the government can regulate your conduct in any way. If they want to make Bibles illegal, if they want to make prayer illegal, you don't have any protection. That can't be the right answer. That's nothing. Right. The other extreme would be to say anything that is motivated by a sincere faith conviction is beyond the reach of the government. So I'll tell my students, if I walk in here with a firearm and say, you know what, this morning God told me that all second-year law students need to die, and I kill them all, and the police come charging in, and I say, oh, wait, God told me to do it, and they say, oh, well, never mind then, Jacob, you're okay. That's your free exercise of religion. That can't be right either.
That's right.
So we got to figure out where in between the line falls. How much religion is protected? Where can the government win? And in 1963, the court decided a case where they established a very high level of protection for religious exercise, what we constitutional lawyers call strict scrutiny, which means the government usually loses. If the government forces you to not practice your faith, you're going to win your lawsuit unless the government can show that it's going after something incredibly important by the narrowest possible means, so that they're not interfering with religion any more than is absolutely necessary. So even under that test, the government could stop me from killing people. Protecting innocent lives is a compelling government interest. But most of the time, under that test, we called it the Sherbert or the Sherbert-Yoder test, religious people were able to get exempted from laws that violated their conscience. And that was all good until 1990. And in 1990, April 17th, to be precise, that's for church state
a day
lawyers,
that's held in infamy, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's like December 7th, 1941, or September 11th, 2001. Some of those for a church state lawyer, April 17th, 1990. The Supreme Court decided a case called Employment Division versus Smith, and they threw out that high level of protection for free exercise of religion, and they came up with a new test. It was actually a terrible opinion, and it was Scalia, by the way, that opinion I've criticized more than any other in Supreme Court history. But essentially, the court said from now on, the government doesn't have to prove this really, really important interest. The only thing the government has to show is that they're not treating the religious believer different from other people. So, for example, if let's say the government decides to go dry and ban alcohol, and they don't allow any exemptions, and if I'm in a religious tradition that says we have to use wine, that's not an option. Wine is an essential part of a religious ceremony. Under this new Smith rule, you lose, because the law isn't targeted at ceremonial wine use, it's targeted at alcohol generally. And so free exercise cases go from being almost always winners to being almost always losers after 1990. Very difficult to win a free exercise case. And that led into legislative battles. You mentioned earlier that, I was one of the folks who led the battle for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We started working on it in 91 and finally got it signed into law in 1993. And but in recent years, again, this Supreme Court, with some changes in personnel, is moving back towards a more protective position for religion. Some of the more recent cases have shown that the court, although they haven't overruled the Smith decision, they're more open to finding that a law is not neutral and generally applicable, and therefore religion gets higher protection. We had a case called Fulton versus Philadelphia, where the Catholic Charities, who'd been doing foster and adoption work in Philadelphia for a couple centuries, I think, were told that they were no longer allowed to get city placements for foster and adoption because they wouldn't place with same-sex couples. and they brought a free exercise challenge, and the Supreme Court said no, because this statute, this non-discrimination statute, does allow some exceptions to the rule. Therefore, it's not a neutral, generally applicable rule. And so we're going to go back to giving strict scrutiny, high level of protection to the religious claim. And Catholic Social Services won the case. They couldn't be excluded from participation in foster care. I mean, the very fact that the city wanted to exclude this agency, which just placed huge numbers of kids, they were willing to let the children stay in institutional settings rather than allow an organization that would place with married husband-wife couples when they had other organizations that would place with same-sex couples if somebody wanted that. So the whole thing was just kind of crazy. But
that's why I'm so exercised about that situation in Oregon, where, again, they're going to let these kids stay in foster care rather than placing them, with a Christian couple that is going to express their beliefs. I mean, in the face of that case, the Philadelphia case, I don't understand how they can do that. But anyway,
maybe it would be good to just kind of pause here. I've got a bunch of different things written down I could talk about, but maybe it'd be good to kind of pause here, because I think the biggest religious liberty issues right now are mostly intertwined with LGBT rights. That has just become enormous. We had the Masterpiece Cake Shop case 5 years ago, got to the Supreme Court. Jack Phillips out in Colorado was a baker, and he had plenty of gay customers, and he was happy to bake them bread, bake them cookies. But when somebody came
off the shelf,
absolutely buy cake off the shelf. But when one of his gay customers came to him and said, "We'd like you to bake us a beautiful custom wedding cake for our same-sex marriage," he said, "I'm sorry, I really don't believe in same-sex marriage." 99.9% of the bakers in Colorado would be happy to make that cake.
Absolutely.
They don't care whether they put a plastic bride and groom on top, or two plastic grooms or two plastic brides. They just want to get paid for making the cake. But the activists found the one guy, or one of a handful of people, for whom this was a crisis of conscience, and they pushed and they got him into the State Civil Rights Commission, which found that he was engaging in sexual orientation discrimination. Again, even though I think that's a terrible conclusion under state law, because I think he was discriminating about an event he didn't want to participate in. He was not discriminating against the gay people whom he was happy to have as customers. But that's how they decided their state law. He gets to the Supreme Court and wins only because the State Civil Rights Commission was stupid. Because they, in finding him guilty of violating their laws, they put lots of things into the record about how evil and bigoted this Christian religion was that didn't fully affirm gay people. And so the Supreme Court was able to look at that and say, well, that state is not neutral at all. They're really picking on his religion. We've got another one in the Supreme Court right now. The 303 Creative case is pending, waiting, could come down tomorrow. It'll probably be more like the end of June, but you never know when they're going to release a case. And I'm sure you've
read it and stayed on top of that. What's your sense? I mean, that one's got to be in that same vein, right?
Yes, I think this is also going to be a winner for 303 Creative. It's a little bit different because when the Supreme Court accepted the case, they said, we only want to consider free speech issues. We don't want to consider free exercise. So it's not actually up as a religious liberty case.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't read it carefully. Okay.
Yeah. And it's but because of the different facts, this isn't a cake. This is a designer of web pages.
Yeah.
And the argument is designing a web page, like writing a novel or painting a picture, is artistic, it's communicative, it is First Amendment speech activity, and you can't force an artist to paint a picture of something. You can't force a writer to write a novel about this. And I think the Supreme Court, again, the current membership of the court, will rule in favor of the web designer and say, this is creative expression, designing a web page. And so the state cannot force her to do that work for some activity that she finds morally objectionable. I think
but
that's going to win.
It's going to be on speech grounds, not on religious freedom grounds.
Not on free exercise grounds. Yeah. But there's going to be more cases like this because, I mean, they're still coming after Jack Phillips. Somebody new sues Jack Phillips pretty much every day of the week. I think that may have replaced baseball as our national pastime, is suing Jack Phillips.
How sad is that?
It's awful, but it's okay. Now I'm really going to get on a hobby horse here.
No pun intended for your Hobby Lobby there, right?
Hobby Horse. Yeah. No, right. That wasn't intentional. But I don't know if any of your listeners are Harry Potter fans, but I'm a Harry Potter fan, and there's a line from Harry Potter that says, "Neither can live while the other survives."
Right.
And right now we are in this world with Christians and the LGBT community that both sides seem to be treating it as neither can live while the other survives. Mm-hmm. And LGBT activists are trying not just to get a cake made, not just to hold a wedding, not just to be able to rent an apartment, but to destroy, to force out of business anyone who disagrees, anyone who maybe thinks, gosh, I don't know, that sex ought to be between a husband and a wife who are married to one another. That's because there are still millions of Americans who believe that. But there are also today millions of Americans who believe otherwise. And at some point, we've all got to stop trying to hate and find ways to say, let's live and let live. You can live your life. You can, the law permits two men to get married, and that's okay, go for that. But don't force me to participate if it violates my conscience.
Yeah, and I mean, those of us that are church lawyers are constantly facing these situations where churches are being asked. There are obviously plenty of faith traditions where that's permitted, right? But for those where it's not permitted, for example, all the Orthodox churches, we're constantly dealing with all of these situations where they're saying, well, we want to have the service in your church, or we want to have the service on your premises. And we're kind of going, look, man, there's plenty of other places. Just, let us be. You got your Supreme Court Obergefell decision. It is what it is. Just let us do our thing. And it's just like, no.
Well, and then the part that even hurts me more is that Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity, which is my tradition, has gotten itself in many places sort of closely tied with a particularly nasty form of Republican politics that gets all caught up on winning culture wars and beating people down and calling names. And,
there's nothing about any of that that's Christian. There's nothing about any of that that's Christian. I don't care what your beliefs are. I don't care where you came from. I don't care where you grew up in. I don't care what your faith tradition is. If you call yourself to be a Christian, there ain't nothing about what our Lord and Savior taught that would suggest that kind of vitriol on any side is ever justified.
Jesus didn't say they will know you're my disciples because you are meaner and tougher and fight harder for your policy positions than anybody else, and so you own the libs. He said they'll know you're my disciples by your love.
Right.
By your love. And so, I look at both sides in this and say, we got to find a way to disarm this fight. We've got to get a way to get Christians to say, LGBT people, we may not agree with your choices, but you are human beings who bear the imago Dei, you bear the image of the Creator, and we will give you respect and dignity even where we think you may be wrong. And in return, the LGBT community has to be able to say to Christians and other people who hold traditional morality that you're allowed to live out your your own views and live your life according to your own convictions. And right now there's just so little of that. Everybody just yells at each other and sues one another, and it's just breaking my heart.
So is there a pathway? Because I mean, as we start to think about what these big issues are, if you go back and, as I was replaying just this week, actually 2 weeks of cases, you're correct. The majority of them were in that ilk of types of cases, right? So is there a way, is there a path, is there a case that you can see that the United States Supreme Court can bring some clarity to that? And we can't stop people from saying crazy things and being crazy, but can we get some judicial clarity on that point? Do you see a pathway for that?
I think the ultimate answer legally needs to be that the Supreme Court really reinvigorates free exercise and gets it back to where it was before 1990. Because before 1990, if the law would cause you to do something that violated your conscience, you could almost always bring a free exercise case and get an exemption. Mm-hmm. The law would still apply to people who didn't have the conscience problem, but you would get exempted. Right now, I think the 303 Creative is going to be a winner for free speech, but that's because a web page is a pretty obvious communication. When you're talking about baking a cake, it's a much closer call. Is baking a cake like putting together a website, or is it more like serving barbecue at the wedding reception?
Of course, and of course his argument was the cakes he's making are not just the pedestrian cakes that they can buy, which they're free to buy in the store. It's all the really creative, artistic stuff that he did in his cake. So he was trying to move himself into the same as the 303 Creative kind of context, right?
He was, but there's going to be other cases. What about a guy who rents chairs for events? Can you be forced to? There's always going to be, or who. My son got married in December, and the reception, they had a local barbecue place came in and served a buffet of barbecue. Well, you're gonna be hard pressed to say that barbecue is artistic expression. Maybe really good barbecue. But,
I don't know, down south now, I mean, maybe y'all in Baltimore didn't think that, but down south, as you know now, barbecue is not religion, but it's getting close in some places.
It does get close. Yeah. So I think ultimately free exercise needs to be the path out of this. Yeah. Part of the problem, I don't want to get maybe too much in the legal weeds, but part of the problem here is I think the state laws are approaching this the wrong way. They are writing these non-discrimination statutes in just crazy broad ways that it affects everybody and everything, and then they're interpreting them broadly. So you get the conclusion that the guy who's happy to have gay customers but doesn't want to participate in this ceremony is engaging in sexual orientation discrimination. Well, that's a lousy state law, if that's what that state law means.
Right.
And to say that that's the same thing as forbidding racial discrimination, like the restaurant that wouldn't let black people come in the door, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing at all. But it's, our culture is so focused on non-discrimination that they don't recognize that there are places where humans should be able to exercise discrimination in a non-pejorative sense, to make choices. What do I want to be a part of? What do I want to support? And that the government shouldn't be making all those decisions for us.
If you look, if you look at our Orthodox tradition, Brad, I mean, the reality of it is there are certain things that are restricted to those that are of an Orthodox persuasion. Now, everybody's welcome to become Orthodox. I mean, assuming you meet the other, but I mean, you're not going to stand in the queue for Holy Communion in an Orthodox church and be given communion, because that is a highly important religious aspect. And so,
absolutely,
one could look at that and say, well, you're being discriminatory, and saying, well, okay, that's your words, but I mean, from a theological perspective. And that's that balance that's kind of gotten out of whack now that I'm still, and just so you know, I mean, I mentioned to you before that dear friend of mine, Andy Kahnemu, who's now working with the American Center for Law and Justice, did a program with me last year on this topic. And one of the things that he pointed out was that obviously, now with what happened in the, in the abortion decisions and stuff like Dobbs and everything like that, that it's now moving to the states, right? So now we're seeing all of these state statutes being created one way or the other on where they fall in the abortion issue. And doesn't that feed to the same thing you're talking about with the kinds of state laws that are being impaneled or created with regard to what is discriminatory and what is not discriminatory?
Absolutely. Absolutely they do. And there are ways of finding a better balance. Interestingly, one state that has done a really good job with this is Utah, because in Utah, the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is obviously very dominant in Utah, sat down with leaders of the LGBT community, and they hashed out a proposal for the state legislature, which was enacted into law, which is basically strong protection for the equality and the rights of gay people, but with strong religious liberty protection for those who have conscience issues and don't want to be forced to participate. And there's a model there that has been working, as best I can tell, pretty well, because the two sides were willing to sit down together and say, okay, you are people who have legitimate interests and concerns. We are people who have legitimate interests and concerns. Is there a way that we can compromise? Which, of course, law and government used to focus on that, right? We would try to find ways that we could get majorities together by, maybe you don't get the absolute best that you would want, but you get enough that you're happy and the other side gets enough so that they're happy. And, I think there are ways to do this, but we've somehow got to get out of this idea that it's a zero-sum game. And the only way we can get what we want is by destroying the enemy, because they're not enemies. They're other human beings who bear God's image, who have different views on issues. Right. And,
So in the current Supreme Court, as you see the current Supreme Court looking at these kinds of things, because, ultimately, to be honest with you, a lot of this stuff is a litigator's dream. There's so much litigation now in this whole First Amendment area on all sides, right? But it seems to me, and if you look at, what Justice Thomas has been saying about things, that they're a lot more oriented towards allowing the states to have the rights to do what they want to do. And if that's the case, aren't we going to actually see a bigger proliferation of these disputes, but moving down to the state level? Across the board?
That may well be true. And it's, I think it's certainly true that the current court has a more uniform commitment to federalism, to the idea that states are sovereign entities and that many political decisions should be made at the state level. They're more committed to that than the court was just a few years ago. Now, states can almost always enact laws. States have what we call police powers, which is a general power to legislate for the welfare of the people. It used to be said as health, safety, welfare, and morals. It used to be the way it was described. Probably morals not too popular today, but
that's not going to happen.
States can act unless they violate the Constitution. The national government theoretically has limited powers, but as the court is looking more to federalism, the states still have to behave constitutionally. But I think we may. Let me just add one more piece to the puzzle, and that's the fact that our current Congress has basically made itself ineffective. They would have trouble agreeing on a bill that said the sun rises in the east.
It's clear.
It's so important to score points with your base by showing that you're meaner and tougher than anybody else, that they've lost any sense that maybe we should legislate for the public good. So Congress is doing almost nothing at this point. They can't pass a federal budget. They can't do much of anything. So it kind of leaves it in the hands of the states. And that really does change the whole political dynamic.
Yeah, and it's real interesting because one of the things that Andy Economy was saying back when we were doing the program, that my friend that's with American Center for Law and Justice, was that now the abortion issues and some of the other issues have not only just moved to the state level, but they've actually moved down to the county level because they're getting zoning laws involved to either preclude, pro-life or anti-abortion or abortion-related facilities. And so the battle line, which was seemingly, I know it wasn't that way from a practical perspective, but everybody's conversation was always at this kind of federal notion, has now dropped all the way down to the county, city, municipal level, as well as the state level.
Yeah.
And back to your earlier point of the vitriolic communications and inability to have, respectful dialogue on things, it almost seems like that's going to even accelerate now because it's down at the state, county, and city level also.
I think that's probably true. And, it's the lesson for Christians is we need to be engaged at all levels.
And that's a good segue. That's exactly a good segue because I promised you I'd get you home by 10 o'clock, and I'm going to miss that promise unless I get you there now. And that's really kind of what I wanted to end with you now. And if we need to do part two, brother, we'll do part two. What is it, based on your unique perspective of what you see happening in judicial and constitutional law and things of that nature, what advice can you give to Christians about what it is that we need to do to protect and preserve what we believe?
Well, I'll start off by saying the first thing we need to do is love other people. We need to show the fruits of the Spirit in our lives in how we interact with others. Because if we're not acting like consistent Christians, our witness and our ability to impact others is just going to be weakened. So I'm
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but every time somebody says something, I get excited because, Christ's word in John 13:34-35 was a new commandment I give you, not a new favor I'd like to ask you to think about, right? Yep. So, that you love one another as I have loved you. So you are spot on. That's great advice.
So if we did nothing else but go into our communities and show love to all people, I think there'd be a lot more impact than we realize. I think some of these lawsuits and things come about because people on another side of a particular issue see the Christians as being evil. And right. If you're able to be involved in someone's life and say, hey, I see your car broke down. I've got an old car. Can I give this to you just as a gift? Here's the crisis pregnancy centers, although they get all kinds of bad press, do nothing other than say to a pregnant woman, typically a pregnant young woman in a life crisis, say, look, you can get an abortion if you want to, but if you're willing to consider another option, we're going to give you support. We're going to help you get through the pregnancy. We can help you if you want to go into a foster adoption route. We can do that. Just showing love with nothing in return. The more we can do that to the people who perceive themselves as our enemies, I think the more impact we can have. And then try to find people that we can get into positions of leadership, that we can get into public office, who are going to act that way, who can show respect for both sides, who understand that our faith perspective is important to us, but also want to respect other people who disagree, and to be able to start trying to find some of those win-wins, instead of it's got to be me win, you lose, to find is there a way we can come out of this? And there are people like that. They just today seem so very rare. What I would call a statesman. And I don't mean that in a gender exclusive way, because women can be statesmen as well. But that person who, they're part of a party and they have their own political views, but they're more concerned about the common good, about all people, than they are just about a partisan interest. That's what we need to be looking for. We need to get involved. We need to vote. We need to encourage our kids to go to Regent Law School. We need to.
There you go. You got your plug in there.
we need to. Sometimes we may need to be the ones who run for office, and that has its downsides. That can be tough. That can be a difficult thing to do. But to become a member of city council or a member of the state legislature, and to be able to get in and try to have a positive impact. But we are never going to get out of this do loop that we're in. Sorry, that's a really old.
Oh no, I remember that as computer.
Term.
Yeah. That's an old computer terminology for those of you that are not familiar. Yeah, that continuous do loop. Yep.
We're not going to get out of this until both sides start treating each other with respect. And I think it's on us. I think it's on the Christians to start. If we can't sit back and say, well, we'll be nice as soon as the secular people are nice. We need to say, we live for Jesus and we can show the love of Jesus. And then, maybe they'll respond, maybe they won't, maybe they'll respond, but it'll take a while. But I just see that as the heart of this whole thing.
Well, and at that point, at some point, if we are truly people of faith, then we have to understand that there's a critical role that the Holy Spirit's going to play in this, and we need to get out of the Holy Spirit's way sometime. And if whoever it is that we're dealing with just can't see their way to recognizing our faith orientation, then we can leave them to the Holy Spirit to deal with. Maybe. I mean, that's
absolutely. But when I first went to work for Sam Erickson at Christian Legal Society, Sam had a saying. He said, when you get into a fight, you need to figure out whether the person you're dealing with is a wrongdoer or an evildoer. And an evildoer is somebody who really wants to be bad, who really wants to hurt other people. He said, there really aren't very many of those. You don't very often run into a true evildoer. Most of the people you're going to come across are wrongdoers. I think they're doing the wrong thing, but they're well-intentioned. They're trying to do what they think is a good thing. And if someone is well-intentioned, and if you can convince them that you're well-intentioned, I think most of the time you can start finding ways to work together. Now, there may be time, there's always going to be some who are just not going to be open to hearing the gospel, open to hear a different political perspective, open to any of this. But I think there are a lot of battles that can be won if the people who are, maybe taking the wrong position now, but need to understand that we are good-hearted people as well. I think we can maybe reduce the number of these things that have to turn into, I'm just going to beat you.
Right. It's funny you say that, because you just made me think of something. One of the papers I'm writing in the DSL Doctor of Strategic Leadership program on a intertextual exegetical analysis, right, of Matthew 2. But I got into a particular point where I actually was trying to look at it, and I got reconnected with Romans 13:1, where St. Paul is admonishing the faithful that there is a point in time where we have a responsibility to not defy civil authorities, as long as, again, we are still being, consistent with our view of what God has called us to do in that regard. And that, we do have this role to play in a secular society, in a civil society, without compromising anything of what we believe that our Lord has taught us. And so it's finding that balance, I think, that you're stressing, that is really important.
Absolutely. Governments that exist are ordained by God. Yeah, and that was written when Nero was the government. So it doesn't just mean governments that I like are ordained by God.
Yeah,
government
exactly.
is, God does not want us to live in some sort of Hobbesian state of nature where we hit each other over the head with bricks, right? Right. God wants us to live in this world until he comes again in as much peace and harmony as we can. And we can be vehicles for that.
Yeah. That's very powerful. Look, that's a strong ending. But I always give the guests, the opportunity for the final word. So if you have anything else that you want to add at this point, before I cut you loose and do my closing over here, I want to give you the opportunity to do it, because you've been so gracious with your time, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us.
Well, Bill, all I want to say at this point is, can we please do this again sometime? Because I'm having a blast, and I would love to come back on your show. And there's a million other things in constitutional law we can talk about, and I would just love to share with you again some other time.
Okay, that's fantastic. And so here's what we're going to do, because I've got some things lined up here, right? But when the decisions come down, and you're right, they're going to come down in the June-July timeframe, right, as the court leaves and adjourns for its summer vacation, right? We have a few cases now that are going to be of integral importance, and when you come back, I'm also going to reintroduce one. For those of you that aren't aware, a variety of the Orthodox jurisdictions, not all of them, but a variety of the Orthodox jurisdictions just recently filed an amicus brief, and so the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops Legal Committee, as well as the Legal Committee of all the different Orthodox jurisdictions, or all the lawyers within the Orthodox jurisdictions, and I know some of you are listening right now tonight, have gotten more engaged in helping our hierarchs and our churches discern in which of those cases should our voice be heard, right? And so most recently in this one, and we'll see if the Supreme Court grants cert, but there was an amicus brief that was filed. The Becket Foundation took the leading part on this, but a variety of Orthodox jurisdictions joined in on that. And so there's a higher level of visibility that our Orthodox churches, and particularly our Orthodox hierarchs, and we got a bunch of them that are starting to face in terms of how do we find the right cases, the right times to do it in a respectful manner, and still recognizing, and this is one of those things that I know some of our Orthodox brothers and sisters get a little bit agitated about. I mean, there are times when we will disagree on some of the canonical approaches to things with some of our other Christian brothers and sisters. But we can agree on those cases in which we don't want the courts and the judiciary interfering, or the legislatures interfering. And so that gets back to finding that balance of, we joined some amicus briefs, Brad, as you might imagine, on some of the breakaway Episcopal cases. And, we had to drop a footnote in there saying, look, we don't agree with the Episcopal Church's position on these things, but we do agree with their statement, judges stay out of it, And so that's part of that, finding that pathway forward. So you've got it. We're going to get you back on again. We're going to have a bunch of cases coming down over the summertime that we need to get some analysis on, and we're going to have some more further news and developments that are going on right now. So I want to thank you very much for participating in this program, for sharing your wisdom, for being someone that is not only continuing to serve the Lord in a variety of different ways with the young people that you've adopted and brought into your family, with the young people that you're mentoring and you're tutoring and you're training at Regent Law School, and all the things that you do both with Christian Legal Society and everybody else in this regard. And frankly, now that you're sharing your gifts with those of us of another faith tradition. So thank you very much. I'm really grateful to you for being one of those warriors, if you will, a righteous warrior, not a fighting warrior kind of thing at all times. But you're using your gifts, my brother, and I'm very grateful for your sharing them with everybody tonight. So thank you very much.
Your words are very kind. I only wish my mom was still around to hear them. But
she's hearing you. She's just not around down here.
Not around here. But listen, let me just say, when a big case comes down, I typically spend the next couple of days doing lots of interviews, radio, TV.
I'll bet.
So if you even just call me up same day and say, could you come on tonight for 15 minutes and talk about the case? I've probably already got something put together, and
perfect.
I do well on short notice too. So whatever works.
It's obviously, you're, as any good lawyer, any really great lawyers, you're very good at the extemporaneous thing. For listeners here, I was going to send Brad a bunch of questions. He said, you can send them to me, but I'm happy to take them on the fly. And next time we'll line up some of our other legals over here to call you. But I want to thank you. I also want to thank my incredible show producer, Matushka Trudy Richter, who is also our station manager at Ancient Faith Radio, for making all this possible, both on the Ancient Faith Radio platform, in addition on YouTube and Facebook. I'm really excited about the upcoming April 30th. Now, you know that in addition to the First Wednesday program, I have a Fifth Sunday program, and April 30th is my birthday, but it's the Stewardship Calling Special Program, and I'm going to be broadcasting from the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Boston's camp facility, which is, I think, actually somewhere in New Hampshire. But we will have just completed the first ever attempt at taking 4 Orthodox parishes simultaneously through strategic planning. I'm going to be leading them through a weekend retreat, and I'm going to have several of my colleagues there that are going to be participating with me to try and handle all these 4 parishes, where we're going to help them to discover their why, their core values, mission, and vision, and their strategic areas of focus. And I'm going to have all my colleagues come on that 5th Sunday program, and we're going to talk about the real opportunities that parishes have to help discern their why, but also what the vision is and the mission for their parishes are. And so that's coming up on April 30th. And then, unfortunately, unfortunately for me, but maybe hopefully for you, it's helpful. The following Wednesday, which is the first Wednesday in May, we're going to do May 3rd, we're going to do a more deeper dive on the elements of parish strategic planning. So those 2 are going to be back-to-back parish strategic planning programs. Folks, if you found any of these first Wednesday or 5th Sunday programs helpful or informative, please share the information with your friends to tune in live here on Ancient Faith Radio, YouTube, or Facebook. Or remember that every one of these programs are recorded and they'll be released as a podcast version probably tomorrow. You can find them either by going to the Ancient Faith Radio page and find the Stewardship Calling subpage and then go to the date. Today's date is April 5th, 2023. Or you can find them on my website, stewardshipcalling.com, and there you'll go to the Ancient Faith Radio page on Stewardship Calling, drop down to April 5th, and you'll find today's program. And you're always welcome to check out any of the other always free website, services and offerings on Stewardship Calling that cover a whole gamut of programs on effective churches and effective parish assessments and stewardship, generosity, strategic planning, Orthodox service leadership, and a bunch of other things. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to email me at bill@stewardshipcalling.com. Let me know what you're thinking. If you have any questions, we can follow up. And even if you have some questions with my guest tonight, I can reach out to him. But I always end by reminding you the great wisdom that came from Mark Twain that says that 2 of the most important days of your life are, first, the day you were born, and second, the day you figure out why. And if you are not already living your stewardship calling, I hope and pray that you'll begin to prayerfully discern that which God has called you to do with the gifts that He's given you and made you to be a steward of, and that you can start living the most extraordinary next part of your life, as you heard Brad Jacob talk about, as I get the opportunity to do. I want to thank you all for listening. God bless you. And as always, I pray that you SOTP AETJ, which stands for stay on the path, capital T, capital P, but enjoy the journey. God bless. Good night.